without life you wouldn't really have anything. You know, life is sort of like the substratum or the you know, it's what you need to do anything else. Yeah. But I also think there's a really important moral question around taking life. I think, you know, it's largely uncontroversial that, at least in general, it's wrong to kill. There can be debate about particular cases, but there's this kind of general principle that it's wrong to kill. And yet we live in a world where there's pervasive war, there's pervasive violence. Even in a society like ours, it really maintains law and order through violence. That's what Parliament does. It passes laws and says if you don't obey these laws, we'll put you in jail, and if you resist, ultimately the armed offenders will take care of you, this sort of thing. Mm-hmm. And so we have this principle that it's wrong to use violence and it's wrong to kill people, but we also have a society where killing is widespread, systematic, and appears in places even to be necessary, such as self-defence. And so it does raise a moral question, and I think that's an important question to really, really ponder and really, really think about. And certainly from a theological perspective, you know, the scriptures have a picture of a God who commands in the Ten Commandments, you know, not to kill, but also has situations where God appears to permit or condone or even command killing in certain circumstances. So there is a kind of moral issue that really needs to be worked out here, and I think it's easy sometimes, because, you know, if we're not a murderer, we're not running around shooting people, to sort of sit back and just take that for granted. But I think sometimes questions need to be asked about, you know, what is this about? Why is it wrong to kill? What is the basis for this? Or at least, when does that principle apply? When does it not apply? How do we make sense of that? So that when we do things in our lives and we face these kinds of questions, we have somewhere to stand on, really.
In terms of the debate, the two sides of the debate, mm-hmm. I suppose, the right to life, the right to choose, is it as simple as that?
Not really, in the sense that there is a continuum of perspectives on this. There are two issues here. Firstly, if you say that abortion is homicide, you can say that at different points in pregnancy. For example, between conception and birth, there's probably 3 or 4 different points that people in the literature, of at least some people, would point to as claiming this is a point when what you've got is a human being protected by the rule against homicide. So even if you say there's a right to life, there can still be questions about when that kicks in. Also, I think the idea of right to life and right to choose really is in some ways an ill thought out sloganising way of saying it, because, you know, people's right to choose, for example, is never absolute. I don't have the right to choose to rape people. I have the right to choose to kill people. I don't have the right to choose to murder people. So there is a sense in which the idea that you have a right to choose abortion is parasitic on the idea that, well, abortion isn't really homicide. The only way you can really get around that is if you say, well, look, it's a case of justifiable homicide because the fetus is some kind of parasite and is some kind of intrusive and this sort of thing. But then that requires you to sort of spell out issues about self-defence and when is someone an aggressor and when is someone dependent and reliant on you and so on. So really those slogans avoid the issues. They're ways of sort of sloganising and often trivialising two sides. I think there's a lot more going on in that debate.
Christians have a bit of a bad reputation on this one for being aggressively pro-life, mm-hmm. waving placards, shouting slogans, as you say. Is this the best way of engaging?
Well, it's not always the best way of engaging, but I will say a little bit about that, as I think that is to some extent unfair and unjustified, in the sense that there's a lot of political advocacy in our community which involves picketing and waving banners. You think of Greenpeace as, you know, going to whaling and stuff like that. The National Party had a conference the other day. There were people outside. So we generally tolerate that in our society. There is this tendency that when Christians do it, for it suddenly to be, oh my goodness, these people are aggressive and harassing. Yet that's a normal part of political discourse in our society. That probably has... I've never been a great fan of protesting and picketing in general, because it seems to me that it's largely coercive. It's people standing up, holding up signs which maybe have 3 or 4 sentences on them, so they don't have much substance, saying, all you're saying is, here is a large number of people who agree with us. Now that may politically intimidate people in certain situations. It may be embarrassing. It may show it may be a way of provoking a discussion on an issue. But ultimately, if somebody adopts a position because a group of people outside put up a sign supporting it, then they've got a very shallow commitment to that position. So that can force a kind of... I mean, Martin Luther King talked about sit-ins this way. He said sit-ins, he was criticised that it wasn't, you know, didn't involve negotiation, and he said sit-ins are a way of bringing about negotiation, right? And so, you know, I think political protest can have its place, but it has to be supplemented with really sensible discussion, really sensible advocacy, really sensible answers to the kind of questions people ask, dialogue and persuasion. Otherwise, it just becomes, oh, there's those people who nobody listens to ranting and raving again.
Is there a clear Christian view on this topic? If we call ourselves followers of Jesus, should we all be pro-lifers, do you think?
Well, I'll say a couple of things there. Firstly, there are a couple of things I think Scripture is quite clear on. One is that Scripture accepts that it's generally wrong to kill. Now in Scripture there is some evidence in Scripture that maybe something like capital punishment in certain circumstances for certain kinds of criminal activity, or that there might be certain forms of defensive wars or something. So there's cases like that, but by and large the idea is it's wrong to kill, and certainly it's wrong to kill innocent human life, absent some kind of special divine revelation or something like that. So I think that's a fairly, and that's been largely a consensus. The other question then comes about is, what is it wrong to kill? And here I think where the Christian narrative is important is that Christianity sees human beings as made in the image of God and set apart from animals. So human beings are not, at least in terms of morally, the same as animals. Human beings are, as human beings, fundamentally different. And those are really the two fundamental questions. So a person has to, if they're going to support abortion, they have to either hold that the fetus is not an innocent human being, or they have to hold that a fetus is not a human being. Now, most people who support abortion rights today accept that the fetus is a human being. What they say is that it's not a person. So in other words, they don't accept the idea that human beings are sort of set apart in a special way. What they say is that human beings really fundamentally are no morally different to any other animal. They have to have certain attributes such as personhood. Now, once you move down that line, then you have to say, well, what are these attributes of personhood? And that's when things you start getting conclusions, I think, that take you further away from at least the broad consensus of what Christian theologians do. I do think there could be debate about early stages of pregnancy, about when exactly you have a human being on the stage. Interestingly, historically, the Church has pretty much held a view that fairly early on in pregnancy a fetus is human being, but there has been some debate at certain points in history about whether the very early fetus was a human being or not a human being. But I think but what I would say, I think it's very hard to say that a fetus is not a human being and an infant is. I think it's very hard to just say that. An infant is a human being, a fetus is a human being biologically, genetically, in terms of its anatomy, all that sort of stuff. And neither of them are persons in the way that word is used in the bioethical literature. Neither of them are self-conscious, rational, autonomous beings. They have the potential to be, but they are not yet. So it's actually very hard to sort of non-arbitrarily say, well, look, a fetus isn't, and an infant is. And I think a lot of ethicists who are secular appreciate this, and so they develop fairly sophisticated understandings of human beings or persons or whatever to try and either say that infanticide is okay, or that we don't kill infants, but the reason we don't kill infants is not because they're people, but because parents don't want their kids killed, or something like this. Which, once you start down that path, I think, opening questions which maybe from a secular viewpoint you can come up with answers for, but from a Christian viewpoint you're going to have to start departing from the idea that it's wrong to kill human beings or innocent human beings in general.